The morning of September 14th, 1944 arrived cold and gray over the Peel marshes of the Netherlands, the kind of gray that pressed down on a man's shoulders like wet wool. Private First Class Roy Calvert sat in the loader's position of a Sherman tank that nobody, least of all Roy Calvert, would have chosen for a fight. The hull was dented along the left sponson where a German 88 had grazed it 6 weeks earlier near the Belgian border. The gun mantlet had been welded shut at an angle so slight that most mechanics had missed it entirely. Most, not all. The engine burned oil at a rate that left a thin blue haze hanging over the exhaust vents every morning. The crew had taken to calling the tank Old Phyllis, partly as a joke, partly as the kind of dark affection soldiers develop for things that have failed to kill them yet. Calvert was 22 years old. He had grown up in Youngstown, Ohio, in a house where his father worked rolling steel at the Republic Mill. He understood machines the way men from steel towns understand them, not through manuals, but through the particular language of metal under stress. He knew when a sound was wrong before he could name why. That morning, loading 75mm shells into the ready rack with a methodical rhythm he had developed over 11 weeks of continuous operation since Normandy, he knew several things were wrong with Old Phyllis. He simply did not know how wrong. Sergeant Dale Whitmore, the tank commander, was 26 and had been an armor since Fort Knox in 1942. He stood in the open cupola with his binoculars trained east across the flooded fields toward the raised road embankment that ran straight as a Roman road through the marshland. Somewhere beyond that embankment, intelligence had reported the presence of German armor. The report said possibly 2 Panthers. The report was wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. There were 4. And they had been waiting since before dawn. To understand what Roy Calvert and Dale Whitmore were about to face, and why their survival would come to seem not merely improbable, but nearly inexplicable to the German officers who reviewed the after-action reports weeks later, it is necessary to understand what the Sherman tank was, what was not, and what the summer 1944 had done to both the men who fought in them and the machines themselves. The M4 Sherman had entered American service in 1942 as a sound, reliable, standardized medium tank. It was not designed to defeat heavy German armor in a direct frontal engagement. It was designed to be produced in enormous quantities, to be maintained by ordinary mechanics with standard tools, to be fueled by the same supply chains that fed American trucks and jeeps, and to be available in overwhelming numbers wherever American ground forces needed armored support. These were not trivial qualities. They were, in fact, the qualities that would ultimately win the war in the West. But in the autumn of 1944, with American armor grinding through the flooded lowlands of the Netherlands against an enemy who had spent 3 years refining their defensive doctrine and concentrating their most powerful remaining tanks along the approaches to Germany itself, those institutional virtues offered cold comfort to the men sitting inside Shermans. The German Panther tank, the Panzerkampfwagen V, had entered service in 1943 following the catastrophic performance of earlier German armor against Soviet T-34s at Kharkov. It was conceived as a direct response to a specific problem, the need for a tank that combined sloped armor protection with high velocity, long-barrel 75mm gun capable of defeating enemy armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. In these aims, the Panther largely succeeded. Its frontal hull armor, angled at 55 degrees, was 80 millimeters thick. The gun mantlet protecting the turret was 100 millimeters. The 75mm KWK-42 cannon could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor at ranges approaching 1,500 meters under standard conditions. The Sherman standard 75mm M3 gun could penetrate the Panther's frontal armor reliably only below 200 meters, and only then if the round struck at close to a perpendicular angle. These were not propaganda figures. They were confirmed by American Ordnance Department tests conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland using captured German vehicles. Tests whose results circulated through American Army units in the field and settled into the consciousness of every Sherman crew with the quiet, persistent weight of a fact that cannot be argued away. What this disparity meant in practical terms was that an American tank crew engaging a Panther frontally at any range beyond 200 meters was engaging in an act of considerable courage, because the math was not in their favor. The Panther could kill them before they could reliably kill it. Every experienced Sherman commander in the European theater understood this. The tactical solutions that emerged from this understanding, flanking approaches, concentrated fire from multiple Shermans against a single target, the use of terrain to close a range before engaging, were real and effective, but they depended on having room to maneuver, on having multiple vehicles available, on having the ground and the time to execute them properly. The Peel marshes offered none of these things. The terrain was flat, waterlogged, and channeled by drainage ditches and raised embankments that funneled armor movement onto a handful of roads and elevated tracks. In this landscape, a defending tank position hull down behind an embankment and covering a straight road approach held every possible advantage. The attacking tank had to come forward on a fixed axis, presenting its frontal armor to a gun that could defeat it at ranges where the Sherman's own gun could not reply effectively. Sergeant Whitmore understood all of this. He had been thinking about it since before dawn, when the intelligence report had arrived with its notation of possibly 2 Panthers somewhere east of the embankment. He had studied the ground with his binoculars for 40 minutes. He had spoken with the infantry platoon commander, whose riflemen would advance along the ditch line flanking the road. He had examined old Phyllis's gun with the cruise gunner, Corporal Eugene Tanner, checking the sight calibration with particular attention of a man who knows his margin for error is very small. Tanner was from Knoxville, Tennessee, and had been Whitmore's gunner since Normandy. He had destroyed 3 German vehicles, 2 half-tracks and a Panzer IV in that time. He had never fired at a Panther. He had seen one burning near St. Lo in July, killed by another Sherman that had flanked it through an orchard, and he had walked past it afterward and looked at the hole the armor-piercing round had punched through the side armor below the turret ring, and had stood there for a moment doing the geometry in his head, and understanding exactly why the round had needed to come from the side, and what would have happened if it had come from the front instead. The 4th member of old Phyllis's crew was the driver, Private Thomas Beckett, 20 years old, from Scranton, Pennsylvania. Beckett had learned to drive tanks at Fort Knox and had arrived in the replacement stream in Normandy in early July, joining the crew 2 days after their previous driver had been wounded by artillery shrapnel near Corentin. He was, by the reckoning of everyone in the crew, an exceptionally good driver, instinctive, smooth, with the rare ability to read terrain quickly and make adjustments before being told. This skill would matter before the morning was over. The unit was the 2nd Armored Division's Combat Command B, part of the broad armored push that had swept across France in August and was now stalling against the stiffening German defense along the approaches to the Siegfried Line and the German border. By mid-September, the extraordinary momentum of the summer breakout had dissipated. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles to the Normandy beaches. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition was limited. The divisions that had covered 50 miles in a day during August were now measuring their progress in hundreds of meters per day, trading casualties for ground against an enemy who had retreated to prepare positions and was fighting with particular ferocity of a force defending its homeland's doorstep. Old Phyllis was not the only damaged tank in the unit. The 2nd Armored had been in continuous operations since the breakout from St. Lo in late July. The maintenance sections worked around the clock. Replacement vehicles arrived and were distributed, but the pace of operations had outrun the capacity to keep every tank fully operational. Vehicles that would have been pulled from service for major repairs in a training environment were kept running with field expedient fixes because the tactical situation demanded every available vehicle. Old Phyllis's angled mantlet weld was the result of a repair made under artillery fire near Mons, Belgium, 2 weeks earlier. The weld held, the traverse functioned, the gun fired. Those were the operational criteria that mattered. What the angled mantlet meant in practical terms was a slight restriction in the gun's maximum elevation to the left, roughly 3 degrees less than the technical manual specified. On open ground against a target at the same elevation, this was irrelevant. In the Peel marshes, where the Panthers would be positioned hull down behind a raised embankment above the road level, it might matter considerably. Calvert and Whitmore had discussed this the previous evening. They had not reached a satisfying conclusion. At 0800 hours, Whitmore received his orders from the company commander by radio. 3rd Platoon would advance along the main road toward the embankment. Old Phyllis was third in the column behind Lieutenant Frank Osgood's tank and Staff Sergeant Len Kowalski's. Two more Shermans followed behind. The infantry would move parallel through the ditch line. Artillery support was available on call, but the observed fire would require several minutes to adjust onto a specific target, and in the confined terrain, the margin between the German positions and the American infantry was likely to be too narrow for safe use of large-caliber artillery once close combat began. The column moved out at 08:15. The road ran straight and elevated perhaps a meter above the surrounding marshland, with deep drainage ditches on either side. Any tank that went off the road in this terrain would bog immediately in the soft ground. There was no flanking. There was no maneuver. There was only the road, running east toward the embankment that Whitmore could see clearly now in his binoculars, a raised line of earth perhaps 800 meters distant, and somewhere behind it, the German tanks waiting in their prepared positions. Calvert sat in his loader's position and felt the familiar weight of the first shell in the ready rack against his left hand. The round was armor-piercing, capped. The standard anti-tank ammunition, its copper rotating band worn slightly from storage in a rack. The propellant charge behind it producing a muzzle velocity of 619 meters per second when the breech closed and the firing circuit completed. He had loaded this shell and its identical predecessors hundreds of times. The motion was automatic. Pull, turn, ram, close, tap Tanner's shoulder. In the last 11 weeks, that sequence had become the most natural physical act in his life, more natural than eating, more natural than walking. He was thinking about the mantlet weld when Lieutenant Osgood's tank at the head of the column exploded. The round came from directly ahead, from the embankment, and it struck Osgood's Sherman on the upper glacis plate at a range Whitmore later estimated at 700 meters. The impact was instantaneous. A sharp crack transmitted through the ground, then the secondary detonation as the Sherman's ammunition ignited, and the tank erupted in a column of orange flame and black smoke that rose 60 feet into gray morning sky. 3 men got out. 2 did not. Kowalski's tank immediately began traversing left, seeking the target. The second shot from the embankment came within 4 seconds of the first. It struck Kowalski's tank on the turret ring. The turret jammed. Kowalski's radio went dead. His tank was still mobile but could not traverse its gun. He reversed off the road into the ditch, and his tank settled into the marsh mud with a sound Calvert heard clearly even to the noise of old Phyllis's own engine. 2 tanks gone or disabled in under 10 seconds. The column had advanced to roughly 650 meters from the embankment. The German Panthers had fired twice from hull-down positions and achieved 2 hits. They were not rushing. They were working methodically, the way a craftsman works when he has prepared his workplace in advance and knows exactly where each tool is. Whitmore did not hesitate. Beckett, forward. Tanner, target, embankment. 11 o'clock, possible hull-down Panther. Roy, armor-piercing load. Calvert had already loaded. Loaded, he said. Beckett drove forward. Not at a crawl, not at a cautious walking pace. Forward, accelerating along the road toward the embankment, closing the range. This decision would be examined afterward by every officer who reviewed the engagement. The instinct of a Sherman commander facing hull-down Panthers at long range might reasonably be to reverse, to find cover, to call for artillery, to wait for a flanking opportunity that in this terrain would never come. Whitmore drove forward because the arithmetic was simple. At 650 meters, the Panther could kill him reliably and old Phyllis could not reply effectively. At 200 meters, the situation was different. Getting from one distance to the other required crossing 450 meters of straight elevated road with no cover, under fire from at least 2 Panthers, in a tank with a bent mantlet weld and a leaking oil seal. It was not a plan that any textbook would endorse. It was the only plan available. The third shot from the embankment struck old Phyllis. It hit the frontal armor on the right side of the hull at an angle, a glancing impact that left a gouge 18 inches long and a 1/4 inch deep in the armor plate, but did not penetrate. The shock wave transmitted to the hull was severe enough to throw Calvert against the breech guard and ring Tanner's helmet against the gun sight, leaving a cut above his right eyebrow that bled freely into his eye for the next several minutes. Beckett kept driving. Old Phyllis kept moving. At 450 meters from the embankment, Tanner acquired his first clear target, a Panther turret, visible above the earthen berm, its long gun traversing to follow old Phyllis's movement along the road. Tanner fired. The round struck the Panther's gun mantlet and deflected upward. No penetration. Calvert loaded the second round before the empty case had finished clattering on the floor. Tanner adjusted. The Panther fired again. The round passed over the turret. A near miss that Calvert felt as a compression in the air above his head, a physical pressure he would describe in later years as feeling like someone had slapped both his ears simultaneously from the outside. Tanner fired again. The second round struck the Panther at the junction of the mantlet and the turret face. It did not penetrate the armor itself, but the impact was sufficient to jam the German gun in its mount, preventing traverse. The Panther commander ordered his driver to begin repositioning to re-engage. In doing so, he exposed his vehicle's side armor. Tanner fired a third time. The round struck the Panther's side hull armor below the turret ring at 380 meters, close enough that the Sherman's armor-piercing ammunition could defeat the side plate. The round penetrated. The Panther did not burn immediately. Its crew bailed out within seconds, which indicated significant internal damage, though the vehicle did not explode until 6 minutes later when its fuel ignited. 1 Panther down. Old Phyllis was still moving forward. 3 remained. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What happened in the next 12 minutes along that raised road through the Peel marshes would generate 3 separate American after-action reports, a German regimental summary that described the engagement with a tone of unmistakable bafflement, and a Silver Star recommendation that made its way through the bureaucracy of the 1st Army headquarters before being approved 6 weeks later. It would also produce 4 burning Panther tanks and 1 Sherman with a bent mantlet weld, a leaking oil seal, 31 new impacts on its exterior armor, and a crew of 4 men who had collectively aged considerably in the span of a single morning. But the fight was only beginning, and Whitmore knew the worst of it was still ahead. The 2nd Panther was positioned differently from the 1st. Its commander had watched old Phyllis absorb a direct hit and continue advancing, had watched the 1st Panther's crew abandon their vehicle, and had drawn the obvious tactical conclusion. The standard hull-down engagement was not working against this particular Sherman. The reason it was not working was not immediately apparent to the German commander, who could not know about the slight leftward restriction in old Phyllis's gun elevation, or about Tanner's 11 weeks of continuous experience, or about Whitmore's cold calculation that closing the range was preferable to dying at a distance. What the German commander knew was that a Sherman tank was advancing toward him on a narrow road with no cover and was not stopping, and that his 1st comrade's vehicle was sitting immobile with its crew scattered in the marsh grass. He made a decision that seemed tactically sound. He moved his Panther forward, off the reverse slope of the embankment, to engage old Phyllis at closer range where his gun's advantages would be overwhelming and where he could cover both the road and the ditch line against any infantry attempt to flank him. This decision brought the 2nd Panther out from behind the embankment and onto the elevated roadway itself, facing old Phyllis head-on at a closing range. Whitmore saw the Panther move. He called the range to Tanner, 240 meters and closing. Tanner's first shot at the 2nd Panther struck the front glacis at nearly a perpendicular angle and did not penetrate. The armor-piercing round left a bright scar on the slope plate and fell away. The Panther fired simultaneously. The round struck old Phyllis's lower glacis and penetrated the hull floor, passing to the fighting compartment floor beneath Calvert's feet, to the hull floor and to the ground below the tank, exiting without detonating the main charge, a partial penetration event that left a jagged hole 6 inches across in the floor plating and filled the fighting compartment with vaporized paint and insulation material, temporarily blinding both Calvert and Tanner for approximately 15 seconds. Beckett kept driving. Neither he nor Whitmore could see what Calvert and Tanner were experiencing in the fighting compartment. The range closed to 190 meters. Calvert, eyes streaming, loaded by feel. He had loaded this gun in darkness during training exercises at Fort Benning. He had loaded it in a tank with smoke pouring from a burning vehicle 40 meters away near St. Lo. He loaded it now with his vision reduced to shadows and the burning sensation of vaporized chemicals in his eyes, his hands finding the round by the memory of where it lived in Iraq, pulling it, turning it, ramming it, securing the breech, tapping Tanner's shoulder. Tanner fired through streaming eyes at 170 meters. The round struck the Panther's gun mantlet at the lower left corner, where the mantlet joined the turret face at an angle that introduced a compound deflection, and it passed through into the turret interior. The Panther stopped moving. Smoke began rising from the commander's hatch. The crew attempted a bailout. 2 succeeded. The Panther burned for 4 hours. Old Phyllis had 340 meters of road remaining to the embankment. 2 Panthers were still behind it. What Whitmore did not know, because the information had not reached company headquarters by the time the column departed that morning, was that the German position was anchored not just by the 4 Panthers, but by a motorized infantry company dug into the field on the north side of the embankment. The infantry had anti-tank rockets, Panzerfaust launchers, single-shot disposable weapons that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges up to 60 meters. They had been positioned specifically to engage American armor that managed a close to short range, as a second line of defense against tanks that survived the Panthers' long-range fire. The infantry had watched Old Phyllis close from 600 meters to 170 meters and destroy 2 Panthers. They were now in their firing positions, weapons ready, waiting for the Sherman to close the final distance to the embankment. Sergeant Whitmore knew nothing about the Panzerfaust teams. He knew about the 2 remaining Panthers. He made his decision accordingly, which was, in retrospect, fortunate, because if he had known about the Panzerfaust teams, he might have stopped, and stopping on that road, in that terrain, with no cover and no flanking capability, would simply have meant being destroyed at medium range by the Panthers rather than at close range by the infantry. The ignorance of one tactical threat forced him forward into the resolution of another. Beckett drove Old Phyllis up the slope of the embankment at the point where the road crossed it, engine laboring, the tank tilting forward as it crested the raised ground and came over the top into the field beyond where the German infantry were positioned. The driver did not stop at the crest. He drove over it and forward into the middle of the German position. What followed was recorded in the American after-action report as a period of approximately 7 minutes during which Sergeant Dale Whitmore, Corporal Eugene Tanner, Private Roy Calvert, and Private Thomas Beckett engaged German infantry, 2 Panther tanks, and a Panzerfaust team from ranges varying between 40 meters and 300 meters. The German regimental summary described it differently. It described a single American tank that appeared to have lost all tactical reason, moving continuously without apparent pattern to the infantry position, firing in multiple directions, impossible to track because it never stayed in one place long enough to engage properly. The reality, as Calvert described it years later in an interview preserved in the 2nd Armored Division's archives, was less dramatic and more exhausting. Whitmore was calling targets and directing Beckett's movements continuously, his voice in the intercom steady and specific. Left 40 degrees, that wall. Gun tube, 200 meters. Straight ahead, track, 150. Right. That doorway. Grenadier, 60 meters. Machine gun, not the main gun. Calvert was loading. Pull, turn, ram, close, tap. Pull, turn, ram, close, tap. High explosive for the infantry. Back to armor piercing for the 3rd Panther, when Tanner acquired it at 230 meters, firing from behind a farm building on the east side of the field. The round struck the Panther in the side. The Panther's commander had positioned his vehicle to cover the road approach and had not expected armor to come over the embankment directly into his position. The side penetration killed the engine. The crew got out and ran. The Panther did not burn, but it never moved again. The 4th Panther was the one that nearly ended the engagement on German terms. Its commander was the most experienced of the 4. He had been fighting in armor since the French campaign in 1940, had fought in Russia, had survived Kursk. He had positioned his vehicle behind a barn at the northern edge of the field with a clear line of fire to the embankment road crossing, intending to kill whatever American vehicle came over the top as it was silhouetted against the sky. He had watched the first 3 Panthers die. He had adjusted his assessment of what he was dealing with accordingly. When Old Phyllis came over the embankment, the 4th Panther fired immediately, before the Sherman had fully cleared the crest. The round struck the Sherman's right track, detonating 2 track links and throwing the track partially off the drive sprocket. Old Phyllis lurched hard right and stopped. Beckett engaged the left steering brake, killed the right track drive, tried to maintain directional control. The tank slewed sideways on the embankment crest, presenting its right flank armor to the Panther below. The 4th Panther commander fired his second shot. It struck Old Phyllis on the right hull sponson in the area of the engine compartment. The round penetrated the sponson armor and passed through the engine compartment, destroying the right side oil lines, partially disabling the cooling system, and exiting through the rear hull plate. The engine did not catch fire. It kept running on its remaining oil pressure, which Calvert later said was the only miracle he was prepared to attribute to the entire morning. But the tank was now immobilized on the embankment crest, its right track gone, its engine bleeding oil, its right flank exposed to the German gun below. Whitmore had 4 seconds, perhaps 5, before the 4th Panther adjusted its aim for the kill shot. Tanner had been tracking the Panther through the engagement. He had the gun on target. The problem was the elevation restriction. The 4th Panther was positioned below and to the left of Old Phyllis's current angle, and the damaged mantlet weld limited the gun's elevation left by 3 degrees. Degrees at this angle and this geometry translated to an inability to depress the barrel far enough to engage the Panther's hull. Tanner could depress the gun sufficiently to hit the Panther's turret top, not the hull. The turret top. He fired. The round struck the Panther's turret roof at a steep angle, punching to the thinner overhead armor, 30 millimeters at that point on the roof, compared to 100 millimeters on the mantlet, and detonated inside the turret. The explosion killed the gunner and wounded the commander. The loader bailed out through the rear turret hatch. The driver escaped through his floor hatch as smoke filled the vehicle. The 4th Panther did not explode. It sat in the field behind the barn with its turret hatch open and smoke rising lazily into the gray September morning, a monument to the particular geometry of a bent mantlet weld that had forced the gunner to hit the one angle he could reach instead of the one he was supposed to. Old Phyllis sat immobile on the embankment crest. The engine was still running. The right track was gone. Around the tank, the German infantry was withdrawing, not routing, but pulling back in the disciplined fashion of professionals who have assessed the situation and concluded that it has moved beyond the point where their continued presence is productive. The Panzerfaust teams went with them. Nobody fired at the tank on the embankment. Calvert climbed out of the loader's hatch to assess the track damage. He was on the exposed top of the embankment, fully visible, in range of German small arms fire. Nothing came. He examined the thrown track for 40 seconds, made his assessment, climbed back in, and told Whitmore the track could be re-engaged with the spade tools from the hull stowage if 2 men worked it from outside for approximately 20 minutes. Whitmore considered this. The infantry platoon that had been advancing to the ditch line arrived at the embankment shortly after. They had gone to ground when the 1st Panthers opened fire and had reorganized and advanced when the shooting stopped. Their platoon sergeant reported the German infantry withdrawing northeast across the fields. The track repair took 26 minutes, conducted by Calvert and Beckett with Whitmore and the infantry platoon providing security. The engine oil pressure was critically low but stable. The cooling system damage would become a serious problem within another 2 hours of operation. Old Phyllis could move. It could not fight for much longer without engine maintenance that the field conditions could not provide. At 10:15 hours, Sergeant Whitmore reported to company headquarters by radio. 4 Panthers confirmed destroyed or disabled. 1 American tank immobilized and requiring recovery for engine repairs. 1 American tank, Lieutenant Osgood's, destroyed with 2 men killed. Kowalski's tank disabled in the ditch. Crew intact. The company commander listened to the report and was quiet for a moment before asking Whitmore to repeat the number of Panthers. Whitmore repeated it. The company commander said he would transmit the information to the battalion and that recovery vehicles would be dispatched for Old Phyllis. The battalion commander, upon receiving the report, drove forward to the embankment himself to look at the 4 destroyed German vehicles scattered across the field beyond. He walked around the 4th Panther behind the barn and examined the hole in the turret roof, and asked Whitmore how his gunner had hit the top of a Panther from a road-level approach. Whitmore explained the mantlet weld and the restricted elevation. The battalion commander looked at him for a moment and said nothing, then walked back to his jeep. The German regimental report, captured later in the war and translated by Army intelligence, described the action in the Peel marshes on September 14th, 1944, a phrase that translated from the German roughly as an enemy tank of apparently modified or irregular configuration advanced against 4 Panther vehicles under circumstances that did not conform to expected American tactical doctrine. The outcome of the engagement is not satisfactorily explained by the material factors involved. The material factors. The phrase is precise in its inadequacy. The material factors were a bent mantlet weld, a leaking oil seal, a gunner who had bled into his eye for 20 minutes and kept firing, a loader who had loaded by feel through temporary blindness, a driver who had accelerated when every instinct said stop, and a commander who had done arithmetic in his head at 650 meters and decided that forward was the only direction that made any sense. Old Phyllis was recovered by an M32 tank recovery vehicle that afternoon and transported to the battalion maintenance section. The engine was replaced over 3 days. The track was repaired in 6 hours. The right sponson penetration was welded from the inside. The mantlet weld was re-examined by the battalion maintenance officer, who concluded that it was structurally sound and that correcting the elevation restriction would require equipment not available in the field. It was left as it was. The tank returned to service on September 18, 1944. It was still called Old Phyllis. Calvert and Tanner and Beckett and Whitmore were still its crew. The den on the left sponson from the Belgian border was still there, joined now by the gouge from a glancing hit on the road, the sponson penetration repair weld, and 31 smaller impact marks of various calibers. The maintenance log noted all of this with the systematic thoroughness of an institution that records everything and explains nothing. Whitmore received the Silver Star. The citation described him as displaying extraordinary heroism and outstanding leadership in directing his tank crew during a crucial engagement against superior enemy armor. Tanner received a Bronze Star. Calvert and Beckett received commendations from battalion commander. The unit received no broader recognition. The engagement in the Peel marshes was one of hundreds of similar small unit actions occurring daily along the Allied front that autumn, each one a concentrated universe of fear and noise and decision that lasted a few minutes and left traces in official documents that barely captured what had actually happened. The larger story of which Old Phyllis's morning was a small part, the campaign to the Netherlands, the approach to the German border, the autumn stall in the German counteroffensive in December that would become the Battle of the Bulge, continued with its vast momentum, grinding through weeks and months of cold and fighting and loss. The Peel Marshes engagement occupied a few paragraphs in the 2nd Armored Division's operational records. It did not appear in any of the division histories published after the war. The 4 Panthers rusting in the field behind the embankment were pushed off the road by German recovery teams within 2 days and replaced by a new defensive line 3 kilometers further east. What the German regimental report could not explain, what no after-action report written in the formal language of military analysis could quite capture, was the specific nature of the advantage that had decided the engagement. It was not the Sherman's armor. It was not the Sherman's gun. It was not American production numbers or supply logistics or any of the institutional factors that history correctly identifies as the ultimate causes of Allied victory. It was smaller than that and more human than that. It was the accumulation of 11 weeks of continuous operations compressed into the bodies and reflexes of 4 men. The loader's hands had found the shell in the rack, without being able to see it. The gunner's eye that held the sight through blood and shock. The driver's foot that pressed the accelerator when the rational response was a brake. The commander's voice that stayed level and specific while the world came apart around him. The Sherman was not a better tank than the Panther. Everyone who fought in one knew this. The crew of Old Phyllis knew it better than most, having spent a morning conducting a practical experiment in the question at ranges that left no room for theoretical comfort. But they had also learned in the hard, specific way that only combat teaches, something that no production chart and no armor thickness table can measure, that the tank is only as capable as the men inside it, and that men who have learned to function in the worst conditions that can be imposed upon them carry an advantage that no engineering specification can account for. The German regimental report was right, that the outcome was not satisfactorily explained by the material factors involved. The report was right because it was asking the wrong question. The material factors were not what had decided the fight at the Peel Marshes. What had decided it was sitting in a maintenance report at battalion headquarters, disguised as a notation about a bent mantlet weld that had been examined and left uncorrected because the equipment to fix it properly was not available in the field. Sometimes the damage you carry is the reason you survive. Dale Whitmore continued in command of Old Phyllis through the Rhineland campaign and into Germany. He was wounded by artillery shrapnel in February 1945 near the Ruhr River and was evacuated to a field hospital in Belgium. The wound was serious but not life-threatening. He returned to battalion in late March, 2 weeks before the German surrender. Eugene Tanner was killed on December 22, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, when a German 88 round struck Old Phyllis's turret during operations near Markenfemen, Belgium. The round penetrated. Tanner was the only member of the crew killed during the tank's operational service. He was 24 years old and is buried at the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium. Roy Calvert returned to Youngstown, Ohio, in September 1945. He worked for 31 years at the Republic Steel Mill, where his father had worked before him, in the rolling department, where the work involved the handling of heavy metal objects in heat and noise, conditions, he told his son, in one of the few direct references to the war he made in his later years, reminded him in some ways of the loader's position in a Sherman tank, though he had never decided whether that resemblance was a comfort or the opposite. He died in 1989. Thomas Beckett opened a garage in Scranton, Pennsylvania, after the war and operated it until his retirement in 1978. He was known in the neighborhood as a mechanic who could diagnose engine problems by sound with unusual accuracy. When a customer once asked him where he had learned to listen to engines that way, he said he had learned in Europe and did not elaborate. The German officers who wrote the regimental report about the Peel Marshes engagement never identified the American crew by name. They had no way to. To the authors of that report, the action was defined by its tactical anomaly. The single Sherman that had absorbed hits and kept coming. The gun that found angles that did not conform to expected parameters. The behavior that the report described as not conforming to expected American tactical doctrine. They were trying to understand it through the framework of doctrine and material analysis because those were the tools available to them, and the tools were not equal to the task. What had happened in the Peel Marshes on September 14, 1944, did not conform to doctrine because it had been driven by something older and less teachable than doctrine. It had been driven by the specific knowledge, accumulated over 11 weeks of continuous operations, of what a particular machine could and could not do, combined with a specific decision, made in the second between a first hit and a second, to close the range rather than accept the terms the enemy had set. It had been driven by hands that loaded shells in the dark and eyes that held the sight through blood, and a voice that stayed level and a foot on an accelerator. The tank that the German officers dismissed, in their after-action summary, as a vehicle of apparently modified or irregular configuration, had been a standard M4 Sherman with a bent mantlet weld and a leaking oil seal. It had destroyed 4 Panthers in 31 minutes, and it had done so not in spite of its damage, but in some measure because of it, because the weld that restricted the gun's elevation to the left had forced Tanner to find the one angle that could defeat a Panther that a textbook approach could not have reached. Old Phyllis was officially listed as a combat loss in early 1945 when it was destroyed beyond field repair capability during the Rhineland campaign. Different engagement, different crew by then, Whitmore still recovering from his wound. The chassis was scrapped. The gun was salvaged and fitted to a replacement vehicle. The maintenance log was archived with the 2nd Armored Division records at the National Archives in Maryland, where it can be read today as a column of dates and repair notations and parts requisitions that says nothing about the morning in the Peel Marshes and everything about it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.